Hi again, it's Sierra from Flora Fantastica. Are you the kind of person who agonizes over throwing away food scraps? Are you the kind of person who really longs to own hundreds of worms? Are you the kind of person who is thrifty or wants to impress their friends, likewise gross them out? Are you the kind of person who wants to make really delicious food for your plants? If you answered yes to any of these questions, and then, well, this video, it's for you. We're going to be focusing today on making small bin worm farms. Exciting, I know. Today I'm hoping to show you just how easy it is to keep worms in small spaces. Worm castings are wonderful nutrients to add to your soil, amendments, or just straight to your plants. Packed with nutrients. They're the black gold of fertilizers. Long-term use of worm castings will provide greater results than chemical fertilizers. I'm going to tell you what they are, what they do, how to make the bin, and how to harvest the worm castings. Let's start with what they are not. These worms are not earthworms. They don't live in your garden necessarily, but what they are the little worms that you've probably seen in the packages for fishing bait. There are two types, more commonly known as red wigglers or red worms, and they've adapted really well at eating organic decaying material. Perfect for composting. These worms thrive on rotting vegetation, manure, and compost. They can be found in the top layer of the bedding. They are not burrowers, and they can live in dense populations. To acquire some worms, you could do a few things. You could look online. Many places sell them now. Uncle Jim's Worm Farm, I think you can get 1 pound for about $20, or you could probably look at Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist, maybe Nextdoor. I got mine from Nextdoor. Starting with a pound is usually fine because the worms, once they're adapted to their home, they thrive and multiply quickly. In 90 days, you will have tripled your population, most likely, depending on how happy they are. As your worm population grows, you can add more bins or you can give worms away. They're a great gift. Requirements for worms. So worms have pretty basic requirements. They like it dark, damp, and they like adequate ventilation. They also like some food. Who knew? There's a lot of different types of bins you can buy out there, but I think as far as the stacking bins go, not really great for a small space. They're pretty big. Maybe you want to go that way eventually after you try it out, but using a tote like this is a great way to start. So although the bins are pretty large and probably better for outside, one of the bonuses that they have is that most of them have a container at the bottom for collecting the liquid that runs off of the worms. That liquid is, it's a leachate, and it could be used to make a tea, which is super packed with microorganisms. That's a little bit more in-depth of a process if you get super into worms, but it is amazing for your plants. The leachate itself is considered anaerobic, so it's not really great to use, especially on plants that you're going to eat. You could put it on your plants in the house, but in general, I just think that collecting the leachate is not super amazing. I mean, if you're going to make it into tea, then do it for sure. So for this project, we're gonna use a plastic tote bin that has a lid, and we're gonna drill some holes into the side and into the top. I think it's better to use a bin that's wider instead of deep because worms are not burrowers. They're not really gonna be using, the whole lot of the bottom space of the bin. So, I mean, a 10 gallons kind of a minimum, but you can really go smaller. You're just gonna need to check on your worms more often. So let's go ahead and get started on making the worm bin. All we're gonna do right now is drill the holes. All right, now that we have some holes drilled, not drills holed, in the bin, and that was so easy, by the way, that's my pro tip on drilling. Turns out with plastic, you actually don't have to just shove it, you could just gently ease into it. That's my pro tip. All right, so bedding. You can use a lot of different things for bedding. I don't really want the bottom of this bin to get mushy and gross, at least right away. So I'm gonna put down a layer of paper. That's just gonna help keep it from getting overly saturated. So for their bedding though, you can use a lot of different things. Cocoa core, dried leaves, cut up cardboard, natural fabrics, such as a cotton t-shirt, shredded paper, many forms of carbon that are non-toxic will work. So for bedding, you can use cut up cardboard. You can use egg crates, obviously not the plastic ones. You can use old paper towels, not the greasy ones or like stuff that worms don't like on them. What else can you use? You can use shredded paper. Shredded paper. Most forms of carbon that are non-toxic are gonna work. So it's important before we do that, we're gonna put all the bedding materials in here and put some water in there and soak them before we add the worms. All right, so I also have some cocoa core. It looks pretty dry. I had soaked it, but it dried out. So I'm gonna go get that wet too. I'll be right back. All right, so I got the cocoa core wet. If it's dripping like this, if it's dripping like this, that's too wet. This, too wet. So I'll squeeze it out before I put it in there. I'm gonna add, same thing with this. If it's dripping, then I need to squeeze it out first. So I'm gonna add some of these chunkier materials. I'm gonna squeeze them out. And then I'm gonna add them to the bottom of the bin. This will just, with the chunkier materials, it'll add some airflow, which is great. Really don't want things to get too stagnant. I mean, the worms can handle some amount, but ideally they have a little bit of airflow going on the bottom. All right. Squeeze it out. I didn't wet the paper on the bottom because this cardboard and egg crate is wet. It'll probably get pretty wet pretty fast down there. So I'm not too worried about that. All right. So we have a good amount on the bottom. And I'm gonna actually add the cocoa core. You could also add dirt from your yard. That's gonna have microbes in it. I'm not gonna do that because I have worms and they're coming with their own microbes from their living situation where they were before. I'm gonna add the cocoa core now. I'm gonna squeeze it out as I go. Do it in the bin. I don't have a ton of coco coir, so I'm just kind of probably more mounded up in one area. If I had more, yeah, I think it would be good to use a little more. So there's a lot of extra water in here. I'm gonna squeeze out what I can and put it in here. You really don't want your bin too wet, especially to start. All right, so I only have this much coco coir. Not that great. I would ideally like to cover the whole bottom, but I think it's gonna be fine. Worms are fairly adaptable, so it's not a huge deal. Next, I'm gonna add my worms. These, it doesn't look like much. They keep burrowing under. These are the worms from my yard. I mean, from my bins outside. And there's eggs, there's worms, and there's also other little creatures in there. So happy about that. I'm gonna put them, actually, gonna wait till after I give them their food is what I'm gonna do. That's not true. I'm actually just gonna go ahead and add them now. I don't know what I was thinking. So I'm gonna go ahead and add my worms to the bin. So they're in there now. There's not a ton. I don't know, maybe there's 100. There's not that many. There's a lot of babies. I'm gonna add some of the food scraps that I had collected. I'm just gonna add them to one side of the bin, and I'm gonna cover up the food scraps with some of the coco coir and some of the worms. So, food. What kind of food should I give them? Well, worms have gizzards, kind of like chickens, and so they're gonna want some type of grit. I drink coffee, so I give mine the coffee grinds, and that helps them to break up the food. Dirt has some sharp, gritty things in it, so that's fine too. All right, I'm gonna add these ones too. Hi guys. All right, that's better. Oh, there's even more now. That's so exciting. This is your new home. You're gonna be so happy, hopefully. All right, so that seems a little dry to me. So we'll add some newspaper on top. And this is dry, I could wet it. And I'm going to wet it. With that, I'll probably just spray it. All right, so I'm just gonna wet this down. And because this is an enclosed bin, I'm not gonna wet it too much. Okay, to recap, let's talk about the bin. So you need a plastic tote or a bin. You need some type of carbon bedding for the worms. You need food for the worms. You need the worms. And you need some type of cover on top. The cover, not this cover, but the newspaper that I laid on top, that could be an old t-shirt, it could be a cotton sheet, just make sure it's 100% cotton. Newspaper's fine, or burlap bag is also fine. That helps keep things moist, keeps flies from coming in, and then make sure you cover it. So depending on how active your bin is, you're gonna feed it, you know, maybe once a week. You could feed more often if you have a lot of worms, or you could feed less. I would definitely feed less at the very beginning when your worms are first getting acquainted to their new environment. Also, I think it's good to feed your worms in one section of the bin. I like to do that, that way it's easier to harvest the bin later on. If you don't do that, you could always, you know, a week or two before you're gonna harvest, you can just feed them in one place. All right, so let's talk about what we're gonna feed the worms. Coffee grinds are great. Crush up eggshells are good. You can dry the eggshells and put them in a coffee grinder, and they're full of calcium. Fruits and veggies, especially low acidity fruits. Most vegetables are fine. They don't really like spicy food, so stay away from peppers, onions, garlic. And if you're really wanting your bin to get going fast, chop that food up small because they can eat it faster and, you know, start processing it faster. Surprisingly, they can also eat broken up cardboard. That cardboard in the newspaper that I put in there, they'll eat that. They also will eat the natural fibers. I think there's like some giant composting bins and they had put maybe a piece of clothing in there and the worms pretty much ate the whole thing. It's kind of amazing. There's also a lot of things that you really shouldn't feed your worms. For sure, no meat, no eggs, no dairy, no oil, sugars, you know, pretty much refined goods, no good. The other thing is that it will take the worms a little while to adjust to their new bin, so start feeding them slowly. At least check on them once a week. If it looks like they're starting to go through what you fed, then add some more. Like I said, cutting the food up small is going to speed things up, so that's a good thing as well. If you notice that there's a funky smell in your bin, or there's a lot of flies, well, that's gross, and it probably means that something's off in your bin. Either you're feeding too much, it's too wet in there, or you're feeding the wrong thing. So for that situation, I would, if it's too wet, you're gonna look in there, see maybe puddles of water or really rotten food. You're feeding too much food, the worms can't handle that amount. I've done that before, because I was just like, oh, I'm just gonna dump everything in there. So yeah, don't do that. Just feed them a small amount. It seems like it's going well, feed them more and increase. It seems to be working pretty well for me to have 2 composting containers in my house, one for the worms, one that go out to the green bin. You know, the worms are gonna eat specific things and your worm composting is gonna be so much more efficient if you're cutting the food up and if you're only giving them certain things. I mean, they're not gonna die if you put onion skins in there. It's just not gonna get eaten and it's gonna sit there. And it could hurt them too. You also don't want to put salt in there, anything salty. Bad for their skin. So harvesting. Harvesting, like I said, I like to feed on one side and then kind of what I do is I feed in one section and I slowly move through sections of the bin. Doing that, it means that the worms are going to kind of be in one area, so if I want to harvest some of their castings, I can kind of just scoop it up. There's not going to be tons of worms. There will always be some worms, though, there. So when you know you're going to harvest, and if you have been putting the food all over, fine. For the week or 2 before you're going to harvest, put all the food in one area, and hopefully the worms will move over there. I found that it's pretty typical when I'm harvesting that even if the food is on one side, there's still babies and eggs, and I feel a little bad, but I realized that all those things are probably good for my plants too. So they end up in there. If you really want to be more meticulous about harvesting and not collecting a lot of worms, then I would use a fine mesh screen, maybe build a wooden frame around it, pretty simple. I can show you how to do that in another video. And you can screen the compost through. You could do it over a bin, over a tote, and you can screen the compost through and a lot of the worms will stay on top, especially the bigger ones. So it's another way to harvest your compost, especially if you have a lot. I usually just scoop some out and then use it on some of my plants or add it to soil mixture that I'm making. All right, guys, thank you for watching, and please subscribe, click the like button. Let me know what you think, and if you have a worm bin going at home, how it's going. If you're having problems, please send me a question. I'll try to answer it for you, and yeah, take care. Bye.